Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. Screen time. How much? How little? And particular, how much or how little for our children? It is the question of the age. Wasn't an issue when I was growing up, literally in the last century, in the 70s. My mother would try to contain how much TV I watched. You know, you're allowed a bit of time on TV, but typically in those days, you would go outside to play. And there wasn't helicopter parenting. You'd go to the park. You'd actually go to the park by yourself. You'd ride your bike. You know, you might go out on a Saturday and come back in the afternoon. This was just what people did, and that's what children did. And you walked to school. Times are different, although interestingly, the risks to children from physical harm is actually less now than it was in previous decades. You don't hear a lot of this. It's not popular. It goes against the narrative. And of course, we did have TV screens, but we didn't have computers. We certainly didn't have iPads, and we didn't have smartphones. They are a very recent innovation, and they're useful. You know, I've got one too. You've all got one. You're probably listening to this on or watching this on one of those devices, even as I speak. You know, sometime in the future, you're listening to this. That's great. They can be our servant. They can provide us with useful information. But a little bit like fire, in fact, a lot like fire. We can use it to cook and to cook our food, and that's very useful, but out of control, it's going to burn the house down. The fire is the same. A knife can also be used to cut our food, but it can be used to injure and stab, and worse than that, with other people. So is the knife good or bad? The knife is an inert object. Fire is also inert. Screens are inert. They're not intrinsically good or bad. The question is, what are we using them for? And by that, I mean, what type of content are we getting from them? And how much time are we spending on them? The French, obviously, they've just had you'll be listening to this after the Paris Olympics. They've done a little bit of work with some recommendations for children. No screens before the age of 3 years. No phone before the age of 11 years. And I'll put this reference piece in the description below. No smartphone before the age of 13 years, and no social media before the age of 15. In a report submitted to the French president, a commission of experts proposed around 30 measures to encourage the proper use of screens by children and reduce their detrimental impact on children's health. Responding to President Macron's request, a commission of 10 experts chaired by Amy Benyamina, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, a psychiatrist and addiction specialist in France. There's also a neurologist and some other people. They put together a 150-page report. I mean, seriously, 150 pages. Look, I'm sure they've got references and the like. But given their due, they were asked to do this in January of this year, and they reported by May, so that's pretty good. They were asked to establish a scientific consensus and formulate recommendations for, and I'll quote, the proper use of screens for our children. We need to regain control of our screens and support families. This is good in theory, and I think these recommendations have some validity, but there's also this interesting place called the real world. And in the real world, I'm not quite sure that we can absolutely stop children under the age of 11 having a phone, or children under the age of 13 having a smartphone. It's more about how is it managed. You know, it's a little bit. In fact, I think it's the same as in the 70s, for example. In the 60s, TV was relatively new. There were some families who decided they won't have a TV in the house. You know, children will talk to their friends, and they'll go around to somebody else's place, and they'll probably watch the TV there. And if a child doesn't have a phone, then, you know, fair likelihood one of their friends is going to. And there would be a view that says, well, look, if this is applied across the board, that nobody will. Yeah, it's never going to happen. It's just never going to happen. What we do need is to teach children better control of and utilisation of screens. So it's an all or none approach is not likely to help. And in years gone by, and look, I see this in the surgery. In fact, parents will come in with maybe with one child who's unwell and the other one is okay, and they will often give them the phone or the iPad as a distraction to keep them entertained whilst the parent is talking to me and I'm looking at the sibling. And part of me is like, is this a good idea or not? Are you training the child to use the pacifier as the screen rather than pacifier as a dummy? And obviously there's an age beyond which you can't use that. And there is going to be a role for it. I think there is a genuine role perhaps for this, but it's how much time you do it. And is it always going to be your default option? And do you need to put some barriers around it? A bit like in the old days, you were allowed to go to the park, you had to be home by a certain time. And also there were consequences if you were not home by a certain time. Children can be on screens. I'm not quite sure about under the age of 3, but I'm not also quite sure that you can totally ban it. Children can watch cartoons on TV. Probably these days more likely to watch it on a device, iPad or laptop or phone. It's very, very much controlled by the parents as to when it's switched on, when it's switched off, and what is watched. Very, very critical. And this is up to the parents. It is not up to the government. It's not up to anybody else. It is up to the parents. And not everybody is going to get it 100% correct. That's never the case with human beings. But we need to but the other example would be at some age, children are allowed to cross the road by themselves. There's an age at which they are taken for, you can take them for a walk. They'll be in a pram, for example, or in a caboose. And then at some point, they're able to walk and they will be guided across the road by the parent. They're not allowed to cross the road without the parent or guardian. And then at some point, they are allowed to do that under the watchful eye of the adult. And then at some point, they're allowed to cross the road by themselves. And how's that happened? Because they've learnt, they've developed the skills, they've had some feedback about what's right and what's wrong and how to manage the situation. You learn to swim. You don't just get thrown in the water and hope for the best. You learn how to swim. You've got floaties on initially. Then you can swim a little bit further. You learn some strokes. And at some point, you can go into the pool or the beach by yourself. We're talking about children at different ages and different strengths. So the same concept applies to use of screens. They're not going away. We cannot put the genie back into the bottle. These devices are never going to go away. There's going to be more applications for them. In another generation's time, people are going to say, how did we ever live without them? Perhaps like previous generations wanted, how did we ever get by without, air conditioning or without the motor car? Well, people did. But at some point, it's just so ingrained, and we're probably at that point now, certainly in the Western world. So bans, I don't think, are helpful. These types of guides are useful. The key to all of this, though, is parental responsibility and government support for parental responsibility. And one of the problems we're seeing in a lot of countries at the moment is the undermining of parents and deliberate undermining of parental responsibility by the state. And there's a number of areas, and we won't touch on these today, but we might one day because, this one will probably get banned if we go down this path, but I suspect a lot of you know what I'm talking about. Parents are responsible for their children. The state is not responsible for their children other than in very extreme circumstances. And, there are those circumstances. They do exist. They are the exception, not the rule. In terms of what the child gets to eat, in terms of where a child goes to school, in terms of how much or how little screen time a child has, in terms of, decisions about what sports they want to play, this is all up to the parent or parents or guardians in those circumstances. So screens, can we ban them? No. Are there exact ages for everybody? Look, some 11-year-olds probably have the maturity of 6-year-olds and some 11-year-olds have the maturity of 17-year-olds. There can never be a one-size-fits-all. This sort of nanny state approach of one-size-fits-all assumes everybody is the same. No two people are identical. And we spoke about this in Nature versus Nurture a couple of weeks back. Good ideas include not being on screens at school. There is no reason for a child to have their smartphone in their pocket while they're at school. They can leave them at the, they can leave them in a locker room at the headmaster's or somebody's office. You don't really need to be on your phone during school. You should be paying attention to class. If you need to ring your parent or guardian, you can do that, but you don't need to be you don't need them during school. But we really need to be basically empowering parents, giving them useful information, saying, look, you really want to keep it down to this amount. And I'd suspect, up till probably the age of 10 or 11, probably a couple of hours tops, maybe less. Keeping in mind that screen time can also include learning time. These are going to get these borders. These borders are very, very blurred. Being on a screen these days can also mean reading a book, doing some homework. In another so many years' time, pen and paper might have all but disappeared. So when we're talking about screen time, we need to be very, very clear that really there is good screen time, if you like, and unproductive screen time. And not every minute a day needs to be productive. Alrighty, take-home messages in this. Devices and screens and what goes through them is not going away and never will. The genie is not going back into the bottle. The predominant and primary role of managing this is with parents. Parents. Other people, and this includes, government reports, as we've seen, can provide information, not directives, information and support. But more than anything else, we need to get the state away from undermining parents. We need to put parents back in charge. It is okay to set boundaries and parameters for children. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.